Then sought the gods their assembly seats, the holy ones and council held, to find who should raise the race of dwarfs out of Brimir's blood and the legs of Blaine. There was Motsognir, the mightiest maid of all the dwarfs, and Durin next. Many a likeness of men they made, the dwarfs of the earth, as Durin said, Ni and Nithi, Northri and Suthri, Alstri and Vestri, Althjof, Dvalin, Nar and Nain, Niping, Dane, Bifur, Boffer, Bomber, Nori, An and Onar, Ai, Mjothvitnir, Vig and Gandalf, Vindalf, Thrain, Thek and Thorin, Throrvit and Lit, Nir and Nirath, now have I told, Regan and Rathvith, the list aright. Fili, Kili, Fundin, Nali, Heptifili, Hannar, Sphere, Frar, Honbori, Fregen, Loni, Aurvang, Yari, Egen, Skjaldi, the race of dwarfs and Dvalin's throng, down to Lofar the list I must tell, the rocks they left, and through wet lands they sought a home in the fields of sand. There were Draupnir and Dogthrasir, Hor Hogspori, Hlevang Gloin, Dori, Ori, Duf Andvari, Skirfir, Virfir, Skafith Ai, Alf and Ingvi, Eik and Skjaldi, Fjallar and Frosty, Fith and Ginnar. So for all time shall the tale be known, the list of all the forebears of Lofar. When you think of dwarfs, what do you imagine? Short, stocky, broad creatures with big beards who live in the earth and love hoarding gold and mining jewels. You might think of Gimli from The Lord of the Rings, or perhaps the 7 dwarves from the classic Snow White. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong to imagine such beings. For although these beings are fantasy, fictional creatures, they do come from a real thing, a real belief which our ancestors held about dwarfs and what they are. So, what exactly are they? What is a dwarf? That's better. So what is a dwarf exactly? Well, the image that you think of when you hear the word dwarf comes from modern fantasy. It's an image that is very much influenced by Tolkien and his use of dwarfs in his stories, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, among others. Tolkien heavily influenced the modern fantasy genre and its use of dwarves. We see Tolkien-esque dwarves in a lot of more recent fantasy stories, from games to movies to books and all sorts. This image of dwarves is certainly not Tolkien's invention though. It is something that existed for hundreds of years before Tolkien. This image of dwarves is sort of these short, bearded, underground dwelling beings. However, it was Tolkien who really popularized such beings in modern fantasy, and many of their characteristics that we do find in modern fantasy are influenced by Tolkien directly. Where did Tolkien get his dwarves from? Well, as you probably know, Tolkien was a scholar of Old Norse and Old English literature. He translated texts like Beowulf, and he was deeply fascinated by the lore of these pre-Christian cultures. And it is in this literature that we find mention of these beings we call dwarves. And that is where Tolkien got his inspiration from. And just to make things obvious, Tolkien used a lot of the names of dwarfs in Old Norse sources for his dwarfs. Durin, for example. Dane, Bifur, Bofur. Thorin, Thror, Fili, Kili. We have Gloin, and also the name Gandalf Tolkien took from this list of dwarves in the Poetic Edda. Although, of course, Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is not a dwarf. He still used the name Gandalf from this list of dwarves in the Poetic Edda. But Tolkien's dwarves resemble the dwarves in Old Norse literature more than just in their names. Tolkien's dwarves live underground. They live in vast cities and civilizations beneath the earth. In Old Norse sources, dwarfs too are associated with the world beneath the earth. They live underground, in caves, in mountains, just like Tolkien's dwarves. There, both Tolkien's dwarves and the dwarves in Old Norse literature mine for precious metals, gold and silver and gems, and forge all sorts of things, magical weapons and armor. In Norse myth, the dwarves even forge many of the legendary weapons of the gods. Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, for example, is forged by a dwarf, as is Odin's spear, and a magic ring which multiplies itself 9 times every night. There are definitely a lot of similarities here between Tolkien's dwarves and the dwarves of Norse literature. But where do the similarities diverge? Both Tolkien and the Norse peoples in their literature depict dwarves as physical beings. But in reality, in the pagan mind, they aren't physical beings at all. They don't have material forms. To the pagan, both now and in the past, dwarves were spirits, non-corporeal beings associated with the underworld. We can see their links to the underworld in their dwellings. They live underground. I think that's an obvious one. Underground, the underworld. And also dwelling in caves, which are considered passages to the underworld, and mountains, which are seen as links, ties between the world above and the world below. The names of dwarfs in Norse literature also give us an indication that they have ties to the underworld. For example, the word Dane means died. Funin means decomposed. Hornbori, pierced by a horn. Haugsbori, he who enters the burial mound. I think that's an obvious one. And then I means ancestor. And I think these last two names are particularly interesting because it gives us a connection to elves, which we discussed in the last video. Elves in the pagan mind are associated with the burial mound and with ancestors. And to have these dwarves associated with the burial mound and with ancestors gives us an interesting overlap between the two beings. It is interesting because in fantasy, dwarves and elves are often seen as separate races or beings. Sometimes they even come into conflict. But to the pagan, the distinction was perhaps not as clear. Both elves and dwarves were associated with the dead. They were both the spirits of the deceased, of ancestors. And in my personal belief, I think this connection to the ancestors and the dead gives us explanation as to why dwarves are depicted as being blacksmiths, forging all sorts of gifts and weapons for gods and men. To the pagan, our ancestors, if we provide them with gifts and sustain and nourish them, they provide us with luck and power and wisdom. And I believe that if the underground dwellings of dwarves in literature are symbols for the underworld, then perhaps these gifts that the dwarves forge in literature are symbols for the luck and the power and blessings that our ancestors provide to us. So dwarves, even though they're depicted as being physical beings, sometimes short, bearded creatures dwelling in the earth, this depiction of them is probably just symbolic. There is some more overlap between dwarves and elves as well, and that is in dwarf shot. Last week we talked about elf shot and how elves could cause physical or mental ailments. Well, dwarves can do the same. We have an Anglo-Saxon medical charm called with dweor, which actually helps prevent this or cure this. Specifically, it is to cure one such ailment in which this spirit, a dwarf, is oppressing a sleeping person. This charm is likely about what we would nowadays call sleep paralysis, which to the pagan mind is caused by a dwarf. Now obviously pagans now and in the past didn't believe that a little person would come into your room at night and cause you to have bad dreams. No, it's a spirit doing it. A non-physical being doing things to your non-physical self. However, there is of course some difference between elves and dwarves. Elves, as we discussed in our last video, are the semi-deified spirits of noble or righteous ancestors. They're more associated with heavenly realms and with the gods, and less so with the realms beneath the earth. The only times elves are really associated with underground is when they're associated with burial mounds. Dwarves, on the other hand, are frequently associated with caves and mountains and all sorts of underground dwellings. So while elves are the spirits of noble ancestors, dwarves are likely the spirits of more normal people. People who weren't as righteous or noble as the people who were lucky enough to become elves. It is also likely that for a person to become a dwarf, so to speak, they have to die in a much more tragic or unexpected way. When a person dies in more unfortunate circumstances, situations like murder, accidents, abortions, drownings, that sort of thing, it may be that their spirit becomes a dwarf. But what does this mean exactly? As spirits, they become tutelary deities. They become genius loci, guardians over particular locations and areas, liminal spaces in particular, especially caves, hills and mountains, valleys, all sorts of other features like that. As genius loci, they should be propitiated and given gifts when passing through their areas. But they should probably not be worshipped, or you shouldn't enter a cycle of gifting with them unless they live right next to you. Because where they differ from elves is in the tragic circumstances surrounding their deaths, which causes them to be a bit more unruly or malevolent even. They can be harmful sometimes. They can be helpful, of course, and even friendly, but it is probably best not to trust that they all will be like this. So be safe around dwarves and areas where dwarves inhabit, because you never know when one might not be too keen on your presence. I've heard dwarf shot isn't very nice. So I have used this information. I've used the pagan belief about dwarves as inspiration for my own stories, my own writing. There is a dwarf mentioned in my novel who cursed Emrys, the immortal king. Emrys went into a cave. He spent 3 nights with the dwarves, and then when he emerged, he was cursed with an immortality, which meant that he could not come down from his horse nor satisfy any of his natural cravings. And also 300 years had passed. Now this dwarf wasn't evil, he just wasn't on the same side as Emrys. He had his own interests in mind. But he wasn't a short, stocky, bearded being living underground. He lived in the other world. He was the size of a normal person when perceived by Emrys, and his home was accessible through a cave, because caves in my stories and in the pagan mind are portals into the underworld. I also have a short story, The Girl in the Garden, which features a character who is inspired by dwarfs, and who I think resembles dwarves a lot more realistically than Tolkien and other modern fantasy writers. So perhaps in your search to find a unique way of using dwarves in your writing, you can depict dwarves as being more like spirits rather than a race of physical beings. Spirits who are tutelary deities over certain locations. Otherworldly beings who can be both friendly and unkind. And if you ever happen to meet a dwarf in real life, they like food and drink. Give them a little snack and they will let you be on your way, in most cases. Thank you for watching.